Welcome to Learning Path 1, Implementing Azure App Services Web Apps. My name is Bob Tickleman, and I'm excited to be your guide through this learning path. This learning path is broken up into 4 individual modules, which will be separate recordings. This recording is going to cover Explore Azure App Services and what they are. In other recordings, we'll cover the rest of the learning path of configuring Azure Web App settings, scaling apps in Azure App Services, and then exploring app services deployment slots. So let's get into the Azure App Service. What is it? And I like to start with the why. Azure App Services is a service in the cloud that provides what is called PaaS, or Platform as a Service. And it's now going to provide the environment in which your application can run. Now, we're not going to do application development in here. We're just going to show you, and I have some sample code that I will deploy to the Azure App Services environment. But whether you program in Python or Java or .NET, it doesn't matter. The Azure App Service is what we want to take a look at and what it's going to do for you. So we're going to see the reasons of why you might want to use this in your modern application development. The Azure App Services is an HTTP-based service that provides an infrastructure that Microsoft manages for you in that platform as a service. In another recording, we are going to actually talk about that shared responsibility model of a platform as a service, of Microsoft taking on the responsibility of managing the infrastructure, the physical locations, the air conditioning, the power, the networking, as well as we're now going to take over the environment, whether it be Linux operating systems or the Windows operating systems, and maybe Apache or IIS as that infrastructure. And you're just going to be able to consume the resources of the Azure App Service plans that you can now deploy your application to. So when we take a look at an Azure App Service, I want to go off and do some whiteboarding for a bit to show you how it fits into this category. Now, one of the things that I would say that Microsoft hasn't been great about is naming conventions of our services. We have things that sound the same that are different, and we have things that are different that have the same name. In this case, we're going to take a look at Azure App Services, inside of which you have Azure Apps, in which inside you have your applications. And so I want to try and make that very clear of what it is you're going to get with an app service. And we're going to come back to the content, and you can take a look at some of the details there specifically. What you're seeing on the screen right now, you can take a look at the URL and see this yourself. This is a map of Microsoft's deployment as of the date of this recording of all the Azure services that are available across the global deployment of our public Azure infrastructure. You can move the globe around. You can find the specific data centers that you're looking for. You can zoom in on them. You can see all the network communications that are going around the globe, whether we own them privately or we're in a shared services model. We can take a look at these Azure regions and Azure regions that are then broken up into data centers. Now, all of Azure is accessed using a thing called the ARM, or the Azure Resource Manager. This is not part of the course, but I think it's important that you have this background knowledge to be able to understand what it is that you're getting with this service. And so as a user, you're above in that kind of gray space at the top of the slide where you see the Azure ARM layer, the Azure Resource Manager is what it stands for. And you can interact with that on the left-hand part of the slide through the Azure portal. And that's where I'm going to be doing most of the work in our demonstrations. Looking to the right-hand side of that, you see a box that talks about other ways that you can interact with the Azure resources using templates. You can use Bicep, you can use PowerShell, you can use CLI, use SDKs and REST APIs. So all of these are programmatic ways that you can interact with Azure and would be the recommended method to actually do a lot of what it is that we would recommend on a production scale level inside of Azure. Dropping down below that, you're then taking a look at what's called the resource providers. We don't talk much about this anymore, but it is an important concept to understand of how you gain access to resources. And I'll be using this model throughout all of these recordings to show the individual services of storage and compute capacity and how you access them through the ARM layer and which resource providers they're going to gain access to gain access to the actual resources in Azure. So whether you're anywhere on the planet trying to access any resource on the planet, you're coming through this model itself. And you're seeing down at the very bottom, there's a thing called the actual hardware layer where we have physical infrastructure that you're going to be working with. Now, when you take a look at an Azure region, which I showed you on that globe, here we're taking a look at a place called US East. US East is our largest region, and it's probably our favorite region because it gets everything first. And so you're seeing on the screen there a slide of our picture of what it looks like back in 2014. You see a set of data centers at the front part of that circled picture. Those were our Gen 1 data centers in the upper left-hand corner of that picture. We were then in our Gen 2 data centers. We made them much smaller. Each one has redundant power, battery backups, network connectivity to each of those data centers. And that's what it looked like back in 2014. Advancing this slide, you can now see what it looked like in 2017, a significant growth in the Azure region of US East. And I said, we have a little over 67 regions at the time of this recording around the globe that are modeling something like this. But this is, as I said, our largest region. And we've had growth in there even since 2017. You know, it's now 2025 when I'm recording this video. So you're now taking a look at what are called 8 megawatt data centers. Now, each one of these data centers makes up the Azure region. When we go to all of these recordings and we talk about a regionally based deployment, which an Azure App Service is, a regionally based deployment, it would be deployed someplace inside of this Azure region. Now, I want to introduce the concept of what's called zone redundancy. If I have green user and they were having a resource that they wanted to deploy that was zone redundant, they would have 3 zones. Now, Microsoft manages which data centers make up which zones that you're working with. So it's not your requirement to do this. You just say, I need redundancy across the region itself. And we'll talk about this as we get into the requirements from an availability of your application. So if I were to take a look at this diagram, I might say the data center here in the bottom right-hand corner is zone 1. This one here might be zone 1. This one might here be zone 1. This might be zone 2, zone 2. You got a zone 2 up here. You got a zone 3, you got a zone 3, and you got a zone 3. So across the entire region, the data centers that make up that region would make up the 3 zones that are available to green user. Now, that wouldn't be the same for all users because we've got to balance the load across all of the resources. So I'm not going to go to purple user, and I've got a purple user, and they would have their 3 zones. And they might be different that we've got zone 2 here for purple user, got zone 1 here, got a zone 1, a zone 1, got a zone 2, I got a zone 3. So you can see that the concept of zone redundancy is common between our green and purple users, but the data centers that make them up might be slightly different. Now, what zonal redundancy provides for you is at the region level, a potential failure of one of the data centers. Highly unlikely, it has happened. Back in 2018, one of our data centers in South Central, if you're familiar with that area of the United States, it was struck by 18 different lightning strikes, and it took the data center offline for a period of time. And so you didn't want to have all your resources in that one data center, even though they were in the region, the rest of the region was up, but that data center wasn't. So this is a concept that I think is important. We really don't talk about it in the class, but when I talk about an Azure App Service has the ability to be regionally dependent. So if I have 2 regions so that I want to make my global application available, I might have it in US West, I might have it in US East, I might have it in Europe West, I might have it in Asia 1. So we have our application deployed to different regions, each requiring their own app service plan to manage the resources in that region. Now, within the app service plan, when I get there in a few minutes to demonstrate it to you, you're going to see that the option to make it zone redundant is going to be available to you. And they don't talk about zone redundancy in the course. This is what I think is you're going to get from having a recording of this extra information that makes that content make sense. So what you're going to get with an app service plan. An app service plan is removing your need to have to deploy an operating system to deploy your application. Now, I'm not going to get into it in this module, but in other modules, we're going to talk about application development. Now, over the course of the years, we've gone from what was called monolithic application development, where applications were built in a monolithic manner. I'll use some of our applications, maybe Exchange. Exchange came out on a multi-year cycle. We had Exchange 2013, and then we had Exchange 2017. It took 30 gigabytes to install. It took 16 cores. It took 128 gigs of RAM to run the entire application of Exchange. Now, it would take years before the next version. If you had features you wanted to add, it might have to wait for that major release, and you would have to uninstall the old application and install the new application. Over time, a concept called Agile has introduced a concept called microservicing, and that's really where the app service plan and what we're talking about in this module is really going to take advantage. You're not having to deploy entire operating systems. You're not having to pay for Windows. You're not having to patch those Windows systems on a monthly basis. You're just going to be able to have access to the compute resources that you need for your application. Now, it is possible to deploy a monolithic application into an app service plan. And I'm going to show you some examples of sizes of app service plans that you have available to you that you could deploy a resource to. But as we move more and more to the microservice model of application development, the resources that my microserviced application would need are considerably less than the monolithic app. I don't need to have 30 gigs of storage. I don't need to have 16 cores. I maybe only need 1 or 2 cores. Maybe I only need a couple of megs of RAM to run that microserviced application. And this is where we are ideally deployed to an app service plan. Now, when you take a look at containerization, a term that we'll cover in another module and another recording, you're going to see a lot of similarities between the app service plan and this concept of Kubernetes, where you had containers and you had pods. You're going to see that similarity. And I'm going to draw that out very clearly when we get to the containerization module specifically. So what you're now taking a look at is you're seeing across that big gray area that used to be open, you can now see that you see a whole set of servers that are in there, that physical infrastructure managed by Microsoft that we update and maintain. Now, this is running on a physical server that has an operating system that we then put a Windows server or a Linux server on with the appropriate environments to run your web applications. So if you're running on a Linux box, you're going to have something like Apache, and on a Windows box, you're going to have something like IIS as that service. And so what you now have is we're going to take a look at your repo where your application lives. You're going to then be able to deploy that application into this thing called an app service plan. We're going to go in and create one, and then we're going to come back to the content here in just a few minutes. But an app service plan is an abstract of a concept that you're going to say, I need some resources to run my app that is coming from a repo, whether it be in GitHub or an Azure repo or DevOps or any other repo that you might be working with. And so it's going to be a unit of compute. And it is a regionally based unit of compute. And you're going to have that feature to be able to set it up as zone redundant or not. So it is just going to be you're carving off a set of resources that you see down at the bottom of that you're going to access through the ARM layer using the resource provider for the app service plan. Now, what you're going to then do is take your web app. So this is an Azure app. And we have different types of Azure apps that themselves. So this is where we get into that confusing name. Azure App Services run Azure apps in which your code, your app, runs in the web app that runs in an app service plan. So that's the confusing piece that hopefully I'm going to make clear as we go through this. So I created an Azure App Service plan. You're going to see me do that in a few minutes. I'm going to allocate some resources to it, as well as a series of features. I'm then going to be able to deploy a web app into it, or a function app, a logic app. We have all sorts of different applications that can run in the app service plan. And then that application has your code run in that space. And then it's going to then carve that off into one of those underlying infrastructures. So you build an app service plan, you put an app service into the app service plan, and then you deploy your code. In this case, I've got an if-then-else statement that comes from a repo that gets deployed to in this case, my web app inside of an app service plan that turns it into a running application that then gets carved off to some kind of resource inside of Azure. And so what I've tried to do is to focus in on that app service plan is going to go to some infrastructure inside of Azure. It's going to be running on an isolated, protected environment, not on a specific server. You might be sharing that server with other users that might be running app service plans. So I'm going to show you how, if you need dedicated resources, you're going to be able to get those dedicated resources that only your applications run on the infrastructure you're working with, if that has some kind of requirement. But now I'm going to carve off some of that server that might have 24 cores, it might have 500 gigs of RAM, and I'm going to take 2 gigs of that RAM and maybe 1 core to run my app service plan and my web app that's running my code. We want to take a look at those app service plans in which you run your web apps or your logic apps in which run your code. You can have multiple app service plans. Now, the vast majority of app service plans have one application inside of the app service plan to get dedicated access to the resources in the app service plan. As I said, the yellow one on the top, the app service plan 1, might have 2 cores. It might have a gig of RAM that's associated with it. That application running by itself in that app service plan is going to have full access to that app service plan resources. You'll see that if I have another application, in this case, green circle, it has a different app service plan in the same region possibly, or a different region. It now is going to gain access to some dedicated resources that it has carved off for that app service plan. Now you'll see when we get to the books, they talk about potentially adding more than one app service to the app service plan. So in this case, I might have an app that I'm going to represent as blue square that has some code in it. Now that app service running in the same app service plan as red triangle would now share the resources of that app service plan. So if it only had 2 cores and it had only a gig of memory, those 2 applications would share those resources, and there's no QoS. You could have one that is a resource hog, causing starvation for the other applications in there. But there are reasons to run. You often hear the word called sidecar when you deal with containers, to have more than one application in an app service plan. Not the norm. Most people have one app service in the app service plan, but you can have multiple app service plans. And where that's going to come into account when I go in and show you how to scale these, as I scale out that app service plan, all of the apps in that app service plan would now scale. Let's say that the red triangle was using 100% of the resources of the app service plan, which required it then to scale another instance of that app service plan. So I'm now going to have another instance of that app service plan. I get another red triangle in here, but I would still also get another instance of the blue square, because every resource in the app service plan would then scale, because the scaling happens at the app service plan itself. Now, this is going to be covered in a later module, but I wanted to make sure that you had that concept down. So coming back to the content, we've talked about what an app service plan is. You now hopefully have had a visual representation. You understand that it is a regionally based resource carving of a platform as a service. And you can see that it is built-in scaling support depending on the plan that you have. We have a series of free plans and some basic plans and some standard plans. I'll be showing those to you in just a few minutes. And you get some of these services at different levels depending on the plans that you're working with. And we're going to talk about the ability to scale up and scale down, also referred to as vertical scaling, to gain more resources if you needed to. And then the difference between scaling out and scaling in, which is going to give you more instances from a performance perspective. And understanding how to scale up or down or in and out is going to be an important part for the management of proper performance of your apps. Now, you're going to see that in the middle column, it talks about there's some continuous integration or the CI/CD integration capabilities. This is an ideal model, going back to what I mentioned, that as we've moved from monolithic applications into microservices, this is a great way to now build and support the deployment of your applications. And so we can now support that CI/CD pipeline, and using things like Azure DevOps and GitHub workflows and any CI/CD model that you're working with. And there's a feature down on the far right-hand side. We're going to take a look at this thing called deployment slots. Now I'm going to get back into my beef about our naming convention. 99% of people refer to them as deployment slots. The documentation has the vast majority referring to deployment slots, but there's one place in the graphical interface, they call them staging slots. So know that anytime you hear staging slots and deployment slots, they mean exactly the same thing. One of the benefits of the app service plan is that the plans can now be scaled up and down based around your usage pattern that you're working with. I'm going to go off and actually start that building process. Now, one of the benefits about, if you're familiar with Azure, is I can build the Azure App Service plan and then put my Azure apps into that App Service plan, and then I can take my code and deploy it into the Azure app, which is in the App Service plan, or I can build the App Service plan at the same time that I build the Azure App Service inside of the plan, and I'm going to show both of those as we go through this demonstration. So taking a look at the Azure portal, I've logged in. I'm going to create a resource, and I'm going to go to the Azure App Service plan. With any Azure resource, you're going to have to pay for those resources and assign a subscription to it. You're then going to assign it to a resource group. I'm going to assign it to the one for this course, AZ-204, or I can create one at the time. And then I have to give the Azure App Service plan a name. Now, you want this name to be unique within the region that you're dealing with. And you can also see the type of platforms that you're working with. Now, you can pick that underlying operating system. So remember that diagram that I showed you. We, Microsoft, have thousands of pre-built resources across each of our Azure regions. And you're going to see that we have this capability of making them zone redundant as well. And so now I'm going to pick a Linux or Windows platform. I pick the region that I want it to go to. And this is where you want to pick the pricing plan. So now you're going to allocate the amount of resources for the plan itself. So I'm going to go into explore the plans, and I want to show you some of the features that we've been talking about. In the upper left-hand corner of the graphical interface, we're going to take a look at the hardware view. This is going to allocate the amount of resources of compute, memory, and storage that's available. You're going to take a look at this, in this case, scaling, because it all fits under the resource allocations. We have our free plans, our basic. We get a whole variety of premium plans. And scrolling back down, we also get some standard plans down here at the bottom. So we get a whole set of these different plans. Even though they're marked as legacy, they're still around for at least at the time of this recording. But we have a whole variety of plans. And you're going to get the capability to have the number of CPUs that you want, as little as 1 core. And you can get upwards of 32 cores. Remember I said that you can run a monolithic application inside of an app service plan. If you didn't want to have to manage the operating system, you could possibly do that. You're going to now take a look at the amount of memory. Now, this is volatile memory or non-durable. You'll hear me use that term throughout these recordings. These plans, like app service plans, and taking a look at later on AKS and the different container solutions that we have, AKS stands for Azure Kubernetes Services, that is volatile memory. If that application running in that app service plan goes away, all of the information that is in that application is going to be lost. So you're going to have to find a way to make that durable, and we'll be covering that in another module. And so now what I have is the amount of memory and then some remote storage that I could attach to this, and then is scaling available for that plan. Now I'm going to start off as a free or basic plan. And then I'm going to show you how you can scale this up. I'm going to start off with a free plan to make it very simple. And there's not too much else that I have to apply to this. Now, here's that zone redundancy feature. Do I want to enable zone redundancy or not? So now this is going to deploy that application inside of a data center, inside of a region, in this case, US East 2. If I wanted that zone redundancy, that as this application starts to scale out and have multiple instances, I want to have that spread across multiple data centers as opposed to going to the same data center, providing a potential single point of failure. So I'm going to go through and create that app service plan. So I've got a free plan now that doesn't have zone redundancy. It's going to go through this deployment. It will just take a minute. I can see all those resources. I can see the name of the resource group. I can see the pricing tier that I'm in. Now, coming under the settings, this is where I said you deploy app services to the app service plan. And so I'm going to go through in another example, or another module. I'm going to add applications to this, and that the app services are where we then have the actual apps, which is your code. I can now get the scaling up and the scaling out features that I was just talking about. The scaling up and scaling down changes the app service plan. Now, I was in the free plan, and if I needed more memory, I could come up into a premium plan. So I'm going to switch this to a premium V4, still having 1 core, but now I'm going to get 4 gigs of memory. But also, and I didn't cover this in the last one, I'm going to show you the features that come along with this. So the free plan didn't have auto scaling. It didn't have daily backups. It doesn't have those staging slots. Remember that confusion of the name staging slots versus deployment slots? This is the only place you're going to see the word staging slots. Everywhere else, they're called deployment slots, but they don't have it. So now by switching to a premium plan, I get daily backups. I get rules-based auto scaling, which we'll be covering in another recording, as well as I now get these staging slots up to 20 that I'm working with. And by just selecting this, I'm going to be able to upgrade or downgrade my plan as required. By simply changing the app service plan, now you want to be a bit careful. Doing this will cause those applications to temporarily be potentially offline as it now deploys them to another app service plan. So you want to make sure that you're a little bit careful or do some testing before you do this maybe in a production environment. So what I've done is I've been able to scale up or scale down depending on the needs of my application's growth to meet that demand that you're dealing with. Now, as I said, in another module, another recording, we're going to take a look at the scaling features that we're dealing with. So a lot of that capability through the app service plan itself. To deploy the app services to those app service plans, as I said, they come from a wide variety of locations you're dealing with. You have automated methods using Azure DevOps or in any of the CI/CD pipelines. You can use GitHub, Bitbucket. You can manually deploy them. You can use CLI. You can use PowerShell, so you can see a whole different ways to interact with that, as well as that sidecar topic that I mentioned, the ability to deploy more than one app service to an app service plan. And we talked about the benefits of doing that because they're going to reside in the same compute unit on the same resource. But now maybe you want them not to share the resources and potentially have one hog the resources that you're dealing with. And then there's that deployment slot feature that you're dealing with. The deployment slot feature gets enabled at the app service plan, but the actual deployment slots, when we move to it, you'll see are actually managed at the actual app service inside of the app service plan. So I could have an app in an app service plan that has deployment slots. I could have another app in the same app service plan that doesn't have deployment slots. It could, but they're just not configured if not needed. So all of those possible combinations are available for you. We talked about authentication and authorization in the introduction as being super important. Automatically built into the SDKs for the app services that you're dealing with are the ability to integrate with Microsoft Entra ID and a wide variety of the OpenID standards, whether it be from Facebook or Google or any of those OpenID standards. You can use them to authenticate either in a private Entra ID account that you're dealing with. You could have a business to business or even a business to consumer model for the authentication. But those SDKs and the authentication is built into the app services. You don't have to write them into your code. They can leverage that capability from the app service and the app service plans that your code is going to run. We talked about the resources, compute, memory. You're also going to have some networking services. They can integrate with the natural services of Azure networking. We're going to cover some of these in other modules and other recordings that you're dealing with, but all sorts of communications inbound and outbound. What kind of controls do I want to put on that? Do they have public facing or internally facing IP addresses? But all of that information is going to be available. You can have that app service plan available to, it says single tenant or in even a multi-tenant deployment that you're working with. And we'll talk about tenants when we get into the identity component in another module. So let's jump off and do an exercise that you can now follow if you've got those labs at that aka.ms/AZ-204 labs.
This is going to be a pretty simple lab that's going to demonstrate the creation of a containerized web application inside of an app service plan, something that I didn't do in the demo. I'm going to start off by creating a web app. I've created an existing resource group. I'm going to turn off this randomization and use a pre-built name. You'll see that this is the publicly addressable address space that I'll be able to access the container itself. And as I described, you can use DNS name resolution to change that to be whatever you need. Now, I'm not going to use one of the pre-built runtime stacks. I'm going to go to a containerized app. The region I build in doesn't really matter. I'll still keep it at the default, but I am going to create an app service plan to manage this. It's going to be the app service plan name. Now, remember, the plans that we have different features that come along with this. I'm then going to pick the container that I want to use. And I could either use a quick start container that has been pre-built. I'm going to come to a custom container registry. And I'm going to grab the latest. Does this take a second to create? Going to go to the resource. So I've got my container. You'll see there's the URL. Let's take a look at the sample code that's in there. And as we showed you, the app service plan is what provides the orchestration of this container as opposed to something like Kubernetes. It's through the app service plan that I get the set of features and resources that are being allocated. I can change my plan by scaling it up or down. I can scale it in and out if the app service plan supports that to provide multiple instances of the application. And getting into the deployment center, this is where I can actually see my main container. I could add other sidecar extensions, so the other containers in the same pod that we're working with. And I can take a look at the actual container itself. And this is where I could add a mount to create a durable storage for the application.
So in this module, we've just done an introduction to a platform as a service model, where you now have an Azure App Service plan as a regionally based unit of compute that you could then use to deploy an Azure App Service, which again, not yet your application, in which you then run your application. It's going to provide that platform as a service where you don't have to manage the compute. You don't have to manage the underlying operating system. You don't have to deploy a Windows server. You don't have to patch the Windows server and have it go through the reboot and have it impact those applications. All of that service capability is made available to you as a platform as a service. In fact, I had a customer that went to this model very specifically because they had 6,000 applications that ran across 27,000 virtual machines. Now, that was 27,000 virtual machines that ran Windows. That's 27,000 Windows server licenses. There's 27,000 Windows machines that needed to be patched on a monthly basis. By moving to the app service plan model, they didn't have to do any of that work. All of those Windows servers that they had to deploy and maintain and pay for was now removed from their requirement, and they just deployed the app service plan. Now, it was mentioned in the course material that the app service plans, and you'll see this in the apps you run in them, only support currently supported versions of operating systems. So if you need to run on Windows Server 2003, you're not going to be able to use an app service plan because it only runs currently supported versions. But I'm going to cover in a later module of how you can get around with that, because even though you might be running on some older .NET code or maybe an older version of an operating system, maybe you don't need to be actually running on that operating system, and app service plans are a great way to do it. And I'll often tell customers, try it. If your application breaks, then you can fix the application or still deploy it using that traditional model. So we've seen the architecture of authentication and authorization that's naturally built into your app service plan's capabilities. We've looked at identifying and controlling inbound and outbound network traffic, as well as allocating resources to the app service plans for you to be able to deploy and have your applications run in an ongoing life cycle where they might need more resources over a period of time as your application requirements grow. Now that you know what Azure App Services can provide for you, freeing you up for application development in a modern model of microservices, I encourage you to investigate the first possibility of this is the standard way in which you deploy your applications. I hope you've enjoyed this learning path, and I look forward to seeing you at a future recording.